If you're new to Webflow, in this video, you'll learn Webflow by building a website with me. I'll focus on the best practices I wish I knew when starting out. Grab the files in the description below to follow along. Websites are made up of sections and containers. Sections are where we apply background images or background colors, and they cover the full width of the screen. We have a container inside each section that stays centered within the section and keeps our content from becoming too wide. So on wider screens, our sections grow, but the containers stay a fixed size right there in the middle. Now, to set this up in Webflow, we can head to the Add Elements panel, and we can drag a section onto our page. And inside that section, we can add a container. Now, inside the container is where our content goes, so we can add a heading element into the container. And to see all this, we can click the navigator, and here we have a section, container, and inside that container is a heading. Now, a faster way to add elements is Command E on Mac, Control E on Windows, and we can search for the element we want to add. So in this case, a paragraph, and it's right there under the heading. And while we're at it, let's also add a button. Now, to style our text, instead of selecting each text itself, it's best to style the whole page or the body first. So if we click this blue icon here, we can style body all pages, and any changes we make here will affect the body on every page of our website. If we go ahead and change the font here, notice it's affecting all text in the body. Headings, paragraphs, buttons are all being changed. We'll select General Sans at a medium weight, since that's what we're using for our design, and most of the text throughout our design uses a 20 pixel font size. So this paragraph and also this button text, that's our main font size for the site. So if we apply a font size here on the body, notice how it's affecting pretty much all text inside the body, unless that element like the heading has an overridden font size. Now, the only problem with using pixels is the website visitor can't adjust that size. If they're having a hard time reading the text, they can't change it. So we like to use a unit called rem instead of pixels, REM. The default font size in browsers is 16 pixels. So if we apply a font size of 1 rem, that's 1 times 16. So that'll look just like 16 pixels. If we wanted a font size that looks like 32 pixels, we can type 2 rem. That's 2 times 16. So that looks exactly the same as 32 pixels. In our case, we want this to look like 20 pixels. So we can do 20 divided by 16. And that will give us, looks like 1.25 rem. And that'll look the same as 20 pixels, but the website visitor can actually adjust that. So anywhere that we would usually use pixels, we want to use REM instead, so the entire design can be scaled up and down. Now for the letter spacing or line height, we're actually using 150%. So we can go ahead on the body and set the line height here to 150%. And that's just a percentage of the font size. So 100% would be 1 times the font size. 200% is 2 times whatever the font size is. And we're just going to put that right there in the middle. Now, if we apply a font color here, notice how it affects all text inside the body, unless that element has an overridden font color like the button does there. So for our main font color of the site, our site is primarily a light mode site. Most of our sections will be light mode. And we're using a white background color with this dark blue text. So what we can do is paste in this dark blue color, and we're going to reuse this color as background colors in other places throughout the site as well. So we can save this as a variable to reuse it later. We can just create a variable here. We'll call this dark and save it for reuse. And then for our white background color, we're also going to save that as a variable. We'll call this light, and that way we can reuse it later. Now let's go ahead and style this heading. So if we'll notice, our heading on the site uses a, looks like 96 pixel font size, and we're using that same heading style everywhere throughout the site. So if we select our heading and we give it a font size of 96 divided by 16 REM, that will give us a font size of 6 rem. And for our line height on that, we're using 90%. Now, the Webflow gives all headings a bold font weight by default, so let's change that to medium. And we're also going to want to affect the letter spacing to bring our letters closer together, which it's using -3% here in Figma. Now, letter spacing is under this more type options in Webflow, and if we try -3%, Webflow doesn't actually allow for percent inside the letter spacing. So we can use a similar unit instead called EM. We can do 0.03 EM, and that'll be similar to %. It's based on the font size of that element, and it brings our letters closer together. Now, all of the headings have some margin by default. Margin is the space outside of the box. So if I were to increase this, notice it's pushing this box further from the top. And padding is the space inside the box. So if I drag in here, we've actually added some more space inside this box here. I'm going to click on this and click reset. So for all of the text throughout the site, I recommend leaving margins off by default because there's better ways we can add space in between elements. So we can just zero out the top and bottom margin. And when we started applying these styles, Webflow created a class here called heading. And if we apply that same class to another element like this paragraph, then they'll both share the same styles. And any changes we make here, say to font size or anything else, will affect all elements that have that class applied. So let's remove that class from our paragraph. And what we can do here is name this in a way that we know it can be reused, because we're going to use this heading style across multiple sections. Usually we name elements based on the section that they're in, like this is the hero section, this is our content section, but this class we want to make sure that we can use it in any section. So the most common way to do that is to start with U dash, and U stands for utility. It's a utility class that can be used anywhere on the site. So this is our utility for heading. And let's also go ahead and create a class for our container. So all of our containers throughout the site share the same style. They have a max width of 1440 pixels. And they also have some padding on the sides and a little bit more padding on the top and bottom. So we can go ahead and create a class on this. We'll call it something like uContainer. And let's give it a max width of 1440. And we'll divide it by 16 REM. So that is a max width of 90 rem. And if we were to preview this from a larger screen size, like let's say a 1920 screen, we'll see the container isn't going edge to edge. It has to stop scaling at this maximum width. And for the left and right padding, we're going to do 2.5 rem. And if we hold the Option key and hit Enter, it'll apply across both sides. And for the top and bottom padding, we'll do 6 rem, hold Option and hit Enter, and it applies across top and bottom. Now, we're also going to have this top section being a dark section. So there's an image on top of it, but under that is a dark background color with light text. And we're going to want to use that same style in the second section and anywhere else we have a dark element. So to do that, we want to apply our colors not to the container because it doesn't go full width, but instead to the section. Let's give this a class, something like we'll call it theme dark. So a utility for theme dark. And anywhere we apply a dark background color, let's go ahead and do that now. And we'll apply this dark color. We also want to apply a font color to that element. So if we apply a font color here, then all text inside will receive that font color unless we've overridden their font color. So here we're applying that theme dark to the section. Now we're going to need to make changes like increasing the height of this container and doing different things that we don't want to apply to every container throughout our site. We only want to affect the hero container. Now the best way to do that is to create what's called component classes. Component classes are all related to a single section, like this hero section here. So to do that, we'll remove this theme dark temporarily, and we'll create a component class of hero, and we use underscores to represent a hero or a component class. This is taken from BEM, class naming convention, and we can say hero underscore section. And so now we know this section belongs to the hero, and we can give it the same theme dark class. So we're adding two classes together. Now the way that Webflow handles that, let's say I right click and duplicate this heading a couple times. Let's say we want to stack a class like hero on this heading and make a change like making it all caps. So this all caps didn't affect every utility of heading. It only affected the one that has hero and heading classes combined. So if I add this hero class onto this other heading, these two both share the same styles now. And if I affect the main U heading that doesn't have hero on top, then it's going to affect the hero versions as well. Those are just variations of the main class. So that's how we can make our class naming a little bit more flexible. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we'll remove this container and we'll give this a class of hero container instead. And on top of that, we're going to add our utility for container. So now we can get all those global styles of the other containers throughout our site, but we can make some changes to this. So maybe we'll give it a height of 50 VH, that's viewport height. That means it's 50% of the browser height. And in this case, we're going to keep increasing that to 100 VH till it gets to cover the browser height. Now, the only problem with this, let's return to our normal screen size. Let's say the user makes their font size larger, or maybe they make their browser height shorter. You'll see this text and this content is overflowing out of the container here because we forced a height on this and said never get any taller than this. So for any elements that have text inside, we never want to apply a height. We want to use a minimum height instead of 100 VH. And this means be at least 100 VH tall, but it can grow to be taller than that if the content inside is larger. So we'll return to our normal font size here. And now this is at least 100 VH tall. We want to center it inside this space. So there's a couple different display settings. Block is the default where things just stack under each other. But if we apply flex to this container, we can start to affect the way elements stack inside of this. This is similar to auto layout in Figma. By default, it's horizontal, so each element is side by side, but we can change it to vertical, and then we can either stretch these elements out. In this case, we're going to align them to the left and to the center, so they're right here in the middle. And now we get access to a new spacing property called gap. So if we put maybe 2 rem here or 3 rem, it's spacing apart all elements inside of this flex box here. So we're able to really easily add some nice spacing. And I'll put 1.5 here. Now, because we have some bottom margin on this paragraph, it's increasing the space here. It's not perfectly even. So to fix that, we can go to all paragraphs instead of having to add a class to each paragraph. We can just zero out that bottom margin on all our paragraphs throughout the site. Now, if we add another paragraph later on, it will add even space between all of those elements. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and just copy some of this text and replace it here. Next, let's get our line wrap looking right. And what we don't want to do is just hit enter, because what we'll notice on certain screen sizes is the text ends up wrapping weirdly with only one word on a line. So what we want to do instead is set a max width. And we don't want to apply that to every heading throughout our site, just the one in the hero section. Let's remove this and give it a class of hero heading, and then we can add our heading class on top. Let's give it a max width using EM so that it's based on the font size. We might try something like 7 EM, and once we have that set, if we ever need to adjust the font size, notice how the max width just scales with that font size. We'll do the same thing for our paragraph, giving this a class of hero paragraph, and let's give it a max width of something like 20 EM, or we might say 21, and that's wrapping in the right place. Let's give this button a class of button, and let's give it a background color. We can select this color here in Figma and just paste it in. And let's save that as a variable, and we'll call this brand. And let's also go ahead and set our font color to be dark. And let's give it a large radius, something like 5 rem, so that it's perfectly round. We can give it some padding, 2 rem. We'll hold Option Enter to apply to both sides. And 0.5 rem here, we'll do Option Enter to apply top and bottom. And then let's go ahead and create our nav. So we'll drop a section right above the hero, and inside of that we'll add a container, and we can select the section, give it a class of nav section, and we want to head to settings and change its tag here. This is what search engines and screen readers look at to know what type of element this is. So we'll change this to nav, and then we'll go ahead and select this container, give it a class of nav container, and let's give it a utility of our container on top. Now it does have a lot of top and bottom padding. Let's go ahead and reduce that some, and we'll go with 2 rem on the top and bottom. Now inside this container, we'll drag a new element called div block. Div block is the main box we use to group together elements throughout our site, and we can give this a class of nav layout, And we will want to go ahead and set inside of this, we'll say a link block. Anytime we want an element to be clickable and go to a certain page, we use a link. So we can drag that inside our layout and we can set it to go to the home page whenever we click on it. And let's give it a class of nav, we'll call it logo link. And inside of that, we can drag an image. So we'll open our assets panel here. We'll select this image and drag it into the link. And let's give this a class of nav, we'll call it logo image. And we'll go ahead and give this image a width of 6 rem. So we have a size applied. And let's go ahead and copy this button and we'll paste it into this nav layout. And we'll give this title it something like Shop Now. And we want to select the layout and we want to space these elements apart. So to do that, we can actually apply Flexbox. We can align them to the center, and then on the x-axis we can space between, and that'll put the logo on one side and the button on the other side. Now we want this nav bar to rest on top of our hero section, and by default things just stack under each other, but if we want these elements to overlap, we need to adjust the nav's position. So with the nav selected, we can head to position, and there's a couple different types we can choose. The first we'll select is absolute. Absolute just causes this to overlap, and we'll say absolute to the full top so it fills all of that available space. Let's select this section and right click and duplicate so we can scroll a little bit. So with absolute, this nav isn't really taking up any space. It's ripped from the document flow and it's just absolute on top anything else. Now with fixed, it's also removed from document flow. It's not taking any height, but it stays with us while we scroll. That's the difference between the two. And another option we have is sticky. And with sticky, it takes up its space within the document, but it'll stay with us while we scroll. So that's the difference between sticky and fixed, is that fixed doesn't actually occupy that space there. It overlaps the next element. And for our case, we're just going to set this to absolute so it stays while we scroll. Now we're also going to want an image, and we don't want to apply this as a background image, even though we could, because then screen readers won't be able to read the alt text of that image, and also it's harder to change and replace that image if we need. So instead, we want to apply an actual image element. We want to drag that into here. So we'll head to our elements and we'll go ahead and grab basically an image element from right here. And we want it to go inside the section because the container isn't full width. So it should go inside the section so it can cover the screen. Now, by default, it's just going to stack right above the container, but we want the container to be over this. We don't want to set our container to absolute because it has text inside it. We need to know how tall this container should be based on the content inside. Instead, we'll set the image to absolute since this is just going to cover the entire background. So let's give this a class we can reuse, and we'll call it something like U absolute full. And we can go ahead and switch its position here to absolute, and we'll say cover the full size of whatever it's inside of. But you'll notice it disappeared here, and that's because it's absolute to the top of the entire page. We want it to be absolute to this section that it's inside of. So to do that, we can switch the section from static to relative, and that's why we have this relative here. It means if there's anything absolute inside this section, that absolute element is now absolute to this relative section. Now, what we'll want to do is, even if this doesn't have theme dark on it, we still want it to be relative. So instead of applying relative to these two classes combined, we'll only apply it to the main hero section class. Set that to relative. That way, no matter what, that hero section is always relative. Now, for this absolute item, we actually want to give it 100% width, 100% height. So it's filling the width and height of whatever it's inside of. And we'll go ahead and choose an image here, and we'll just choose this one. Now, notice how that it's above our container, and we want our container here to be on top of the image. That's because this container is positioned static. So it's going to be under any absolute, sticky, or fixed elements. If we switch our container to relative, then it will be above that absolute element as long as it's actually second in the navigator. If the image was second, then that would be on top. If we put the container here, now it's on top as long as it's relative. Now, we don't want to set just this hero container to relative. Ideally, every container throughout our site would be relative, so if we ever need a background image again, we don't have to keep reapplying this position relative. So what we can do is just drop in a div block, and let's give that a class of view container, and that way we can switch all our containers to position relative, and that will affect the hero container as well. If we take a look at that hero container, it now has position relative. If we click that, we see this value is coming from the main uContainer class. Now, something we'll notice depending on our screen size is this image is getting really squished. And the reason for that is we need to set our image, if we open this more size options, to a fit of cover. And with cover, it'll just fill all that space. It'll crop off the image instead of stretching it to fill the space. So what we will do instead is we'll head to all images, and that way every image on our site will be covered by default, and that way we don't have to worry about images ever getting squished. Now let's go ahead and delete this first hero section, so we just have the second one. What we'll notice is our hero section is above the nav because it's set to relative and this nav is absolute. If we move the nav under the section, then it's on top now, but we want this to actually be the first thing here so that whenever someone's using the tab key, the first thing they focus on is the nav, and after they tab off the nav, it'll go to the section. So if the nav has to be at the top, but we still want it to be above the hero section, that's when we use a z-index. So all elements default z-index is 0. If we apply 1, that's going to be above the hero section because the hero section is 0 by default. If we applied -1, then it could be under the hero section even if it was the second element down here. Because the hero section is 0 by default and -1, we're making it be lower than that. So for navs, we usually want to use a high number, like maybe 1,000, and that way any other elements throughout our site, the nav will always be on top anything we have. So next, let's go ahead and build out this content section, and what we can do is select the body, hit Command E, and search for section to add a section. Let's give this the class of content section, and inside, let's hit Command E and search for container to add our container. Let's give this the class of content container, and let's give it a utility of uContainer on top, so it has our padding and our max width. With the section selected, let's give it a utility of uThemeDark, so it has the dark background and light text. Inside the container, we're going to have a div that holds our heading and paragraph together. So we can drop in a div block. We'll give this the class of content layout, and inside that, let's add in a heading. So far, we've been using the h1 tag for all of our headings. This is what search engines read as the main content of this page, and we should only have one of those per the page. For these other headings, we can use h2 instead, since it's still the title of this section, but just less important. Let's give it the class of content heading, and let's give it a utility of uHeading so it has the right styles, and we can paste in our text. With the heading selected, let's apply an EM max width. We might try something like 6 EM to get that lined up. And then inside the layout, let's drop in a paragraph. We'll give this the class of content paragraph. And let's just copy all of our text from here, and we'll paste it into here. And let's select the paragraph and give it an EM max width as well. And we're going to have that wrap right after the word timeless, so 18 EM max width. Now we want this heading to fill 2 columns and this paragraph to fill 1 column. And anytime we're trying to align things to columns, we use grid instead of flex. So for this grid here, if we turn that on, it's going to have 2 columns and 2 rows by default. And what we can do is remove this, set 1 row, and the rows will be automatically created based on the amount of items we have. So if I hit Command D and duplicate this paragraph, notice we're now having 3 rows of content just because we have this much items inside. So that can be created for us. We could add a 3rd column though, and then we have this empty space. Or we could remove it, only have 1 column, and then the paragraph will be in a separate row underneath our heading there. So we'll leave 2 columns here. We'll set a gap of 1 rem, which we'll use for all our grids. And we'll go ahead and hit Configure Grid, this icon here. And now we can adjust the size of these columns. So we might set this heading to be 2 FR, that's fractional units. And so this is taking up 2/3 of the available space, and this one is taking up 1/3. So we have the same kind of grid we were looking for from before. Now, if we head down to tablet, this is getting a bit too tight here on the tablet breakpoint. So what we can do is remove a column here. We'll reduce it to 1 column. And any change we make here on tablet will apply to the tablet breakpoint in each of the lower screen sizes, but it won't affect the larger one. It won't affect desktop. So we can leave this set here with our paragraph under our heading, and that'll stay that way on down. Inside our container, let's go ahead and drop in an image, and we'll give this the class of content image, and we'll give it a width of 100% so it fills all of that space. Now let's go ahead and choose an image here, and we'll just choose this image. It is a bit too tall though, so we could try setting a height here, but the problem is the ratio is going to feel different depending on the screen width. So here it feels more square, whereas here it felt more wide. So instead of using height, we actually want to use aspect ratio. Here we can define the ratio we're looking for, and it'll just stay that ratio across every screen size. Now, in this case, we'll notice the height of our image is 1360, and its width is 1360, and its height is 580 roughly. So we'll go ahead and set a custom ratio, and we'll do 13.6 for the width and 5.8 for the height, and that'll be pretty close to our design, and we're able to lock in the ratio we want. Now, we also have some border radius, some rounded corners on this image of 6 pixels. So here we can scroll down to radius. We can do 6 divided by 16 rem, and that'll be our radius value here. Now we'll want to reuse that same value on other images in different places throughout our site for consistency. So to do that, we can create a variable for this radius, and we'll just add it in here. We can name it maybe radius, and we'll hit save. So now we can reuse this value in multiple places, and if we ever edit it and decide to change this value, it'll update everywhere we're using that radius throughout our site. Now let's also select this layout. We want the paragraph to align to the bottom, so we can scroll up to the top here under our alignment. We'll select bottom left so that all the content inside this layout grid will be anchored towards the bottom. And let's also just give it some padding. I'll say something like 3 rem off the bottom to separate these two elements here. Now we can go ahead and add in our products section. So we'll drop in a section element. We'll give it the class of products section or product section. And inside of that, let's go ahead and add a container element. Let's give it the class of product container, and let's give it the utility of container on top. So it has the padding, and inside of this, let's go ahead and add in an H2 heading. So this is our second level heading there. Let's give it the class of product heading, and let's give it the utility of heading as well. So it has all the right styles, and we can go ahead and just copy this text here from like so. So let's go ahead and give this a bottom margin maybe of 3 rem to separate it from whatever's underneath it. And underneath this, we'll drop in a div to be our grid. So let's give this the class of product layout, and we can go ahead and turn on grid. We want this to be 3 columns and a single row by default, and we'll set our gap to 1 rem so it matches our other grids. Inside of this 3-column grid, we have these cards, and we want the whole thing to be clickable. So we'll go ahead and drop in a link block, and we'll call this product card. And inside of that, we can go ahead and add an image, and we can choose an image from our library here. And let's give this the class of product image. And inside of that card, let's also add in a text block, which if we don't have a lot of text, we can use this. It has no tag, so it's not a paragraph. It's just some plain text that goes in our card. And we'll drag that, our image above that. So now that we have that set, we want the text to be on top of the image. And we don't want to position any text absolute, because then the height of the text, if we have a lot of text, it couldn't push the height of the card down. Instead, we want our image to be absolute. So we can give this image a class like uAbsolute full that we've created before. So it's 100% width and height, and it's absolute. And we want it to be absolute to this link. so we can give the link a position of relative, so it contains it. Now inside of the product card, let's drop in a div and give this the class of product content. And we'll just add our text inside there. Now for the content, we'll switch that to relative so that it's on top of the image. And while we're at it, let's also give it some padding of 1.5 rem. I'll hit Shift Enter to apply to all sides. Now we're going to call this something like hats, and we'll go ahead and duplicate this, hit Command D, and we'll do 01. Now to get these two side by side, we can select the content and apply flex, and we want to basically align it to the bottom like so. And then on the X, we want to space them between, so we have one on each end. Now we also want to get rid of this blue color and this underline. To do that, we can select the product card link, and we can select all links throughout our site. We're going to want to remove this underline that's on all of these links. And for the font color, we'll go to custom, and we'll set the value to inherit, so it just receives from the parent font color. And this is just a great setting to have on all your links throughout the site, so we're not clearing that blue font color and underline every time we use a link. Now for this link, we're going to give it a hue theme dark so that it has the dark background color and light text by default. If our image isn't quite loaded right away, we'll see that that card is actually there. We do want a radius on this card, so on the main product card class, we can go ahead and apply a border radius to round off the corners. Now we're still seeing the straight corners here, and that's because the image is sticking out past the card. If we were to hide this image for a second, we do see those rounded corners on our card. So let's go ahead and select the card class again, and we're going to set it to overflow hidden, which basically crops everything inside it. So it'll always be cropped off when we do this, and that way it's cropping the image to those rounded corners. We want this card to have some kind of height, and we want to maintain this ideal ratio for the card. So this is about 440 pixels wide and 400 pixels tall. So on this entire link block, let's select the card, and let's go ahead and give it a custom ratio, and we'll do a width of 4.4 and a height of 4. So this is just setting the ideal size for the card, but if we had a lot of text in here, it can still push this card to be taller if needed. Let's select this content, and let's give it a height of 100%, so it fills all the space within the card, like so, and that should be good to go. So let's go ahead and duplicate this link block. We'll hit Command D, and now that we have 3 of these cards, if we head down to the tablet breakpoint, they're still looking pretty good here. But on the next breakpoint, it's getting a bit too tight. So with the entire product layout selected, let's go ahead and remove our columns till we have one column. And that way each of these stack under each other like so, and that'll continue all the way down. Next, let's go ahead and create our footer. So we'll drop in a section element. We'll give this, if we head to settings, give it a tag of footer. And let's give it a class of footer section. And inside of that, let's go ahead and add a container. Let's give this the class of footer container, and let's give it a utility of container as well. Now let's go ahead and drop in a div that's going to hold together this text and the social links. So I'll copy this text. We'll drop in a div. We'll call this footer layout. And let's go ahead and add in a text block. So it's just some plain text. And we'll paste in this copyright. And to hold all of the social links together, they're going to need to be wrapped in a div as well, so they're grouped together. And so to do that, we'll drop a div inside of the layout. We'll give it the class of footer. We'll call it social layout. And let's go ahead and drop in a text link inside, which is just a link block with some text. And let's give this the class of footer social link. We'll go ahead and change its text to be Facebook. And let's duplicate the link 3 times, and let's change this one to be Instagram, and let's change this one to be LinkedIn. So we have all that set. And then let's go ahead and select the entire footer layout, and we'll apply Flexbox. We'll align to the center, and on the X, we'll space them between, so they're pushed apart. And on this social layout, we'll apply Flex. We'll align to the center left, and we'll add a gap of 1 rem to space them all apart. Now, on smaller screen sizes, what we'll notice is this is kind of overflowing because our text isn't allowed to wrap here. So what we want to do instead on desktop, we'll go ahead and set our direction to not just be horizontal, but be horizontal with wrapping allowed, so that when we run out of space for these links, they'll eventually just stack under each other when there's not enough space for all of them, like so. And we can just go ahead and do the same thing for this entire footer layout. We'll do horizontal with wrapping allowed, so that when there's not enough space for both of these things, eventually it's just going to stack the footer links underneath the copyright. Now, we don't want these two texts to be able to run into each other like so, and we do want a bit more space between them when they wrap. So let's go ahead and give this a gap of 1 rem on the footer layout, and that way it'll wrap before they eventually run into each other. And when they do wrap, there's more space here. Now, when the footer links wrap, there's a bit too much vertical gap here between those footer links. So we can just zero out our row gap on this social layout. And that way, when these links wrap, they're still pretty close together. They look like a unit, and they're separated from the copyright. Now, let's go ahead inside the footer container and add an image. We'll call this something like footer logo, and we'll go ahead and choose our logo image from here. And let's go ahead and give it some top margin of maybe 4 rem. And let's select the entire container and zero out the top and bottom margin or padding like so. And that way we have these kind of spaced apart. So this is our footer, and that's good to go. Now, on smaller screen sizes, our heading font is really large. Our body font is large. So on tablet, let's select the body. Let's go to the Body All Pages tab, and let's change our font size to 1 rem. And that'll change the button, the paragraph, text, plain text, all of it will update from there. So it's all a bit smaller. And we want to select not just this product heading, but we want to select every heading throughout the site. So what we can do is just drop in a heading element. We can give it that class of view heading. And then here on tablet, we can decide to reduce our font size a bit. So I might say, let's change it to something like maybe 4 rem. And when we do that, it updated every single heading throughout this whole site, which is really great. And then on the next breakpoint, this one here, we might reduce the font size to 3 rem. And again, it made them all smaller, all from one place, which is just a great use case for utilities. Now, we do have way too much left and right padding on all of our containers. And instead of going to each container one by one, we can just drop in a container, give it the class of view container. And here on tablet, we might change that left and right padding to maybe be something like 1.5, and I'll hold Option Enter to apply to both sides. So now across all of our containers, things are a little bit closer. And then on this last breakpoint, we might do 1 rem to bring things even closer together to the side. And this top and bottom space is quite a lot on this breakpoint. So we can change this to something like 3 rem top and bottom on our container class. And notice how that updated every single container throughout the site, all from one place. So that's the basics of building a responsive, scalable site in Webflow. You're well on your way to becoming a Webflow pro. Be sure to check out other lessons on my channel to level up your Webflow game even further.